Alright, so in this video lecture, we're going to look at the other half of the market. In the previous lecture, we looked at demand, the buying side, and now we're going to look at the selling side. So we're going to construct market supply. And so we're going to start off the same way we did with demand. We're going to do a little experiment, a little thought exercise. So recall the number you picked in the previous lecture when you guys were buying A's and I was selling A's, and you're going to use that same number, but now we're going to switch roles. And so you guys are going to be the sellers, and I'm going to be the buyer. And so you guys are cookie makers. All right, you are all making cookies. You are making identical cookies, right? Nobody's making a better or worse cookie. And that number that you picked is now going to represent the cost of your cookie, right? It's how much you have to pay to get land, labor, and capital in order to make each cookie. And I'm going to be trying to buy these cookies. And so what we'll do is, well, again, let's imagine we've got, maybe a group of 30 people. And I'm going to throw out different prices, and I'm going to see how many of you cookie sellers are going to be willing to accept the price that I'm offering. Okay? Now, the thing to remember is that if you're the seller, you want to make sure that at the very least, the price you accept is enough to cover the cost of the cookie. All right? And if I'm willing to pay something higher than your cost, then you're definitely going to want to sell the cookie because then you'll make a profit, right? So if I offer to sell, or if I offer to buy the cookies for $10, well, in the example I said you could only pick a number between 1 and 10, so I'm going to assume that everybody is willing to sell me a cookie if I offer to pay $10. So 30 of you will sell me a cookie. And I'm going to create the little table and the graph just like I did in the previous video. So I offer to pay 10, you guys are all willing to accept $10 per cookie. And then I think, okay, these are really good cookies, but probably not worth $10. So maybe I offer to pay only $8 per cookie. Okay. Now some of you may have a $9 or $10 cookie, which means if I offer to pay $8, you are no longer going to be willing to accept that price. So if I drop the price that I'm willing to pay down to 8, that means some of you are going to drop out of the market. So maybe if I drop the price to 8, maybe 4 of you drop out. So now only 26 of you are going to be willing to accept that price. And I'm like, well, still not impressed with these cookies, so I dropped the price to $6. And again, there's going to be some of you who have cookies that cost, $7 or $8 who can no longer, afford to accept a price of $6 because you'd be losing money. The rest of you that have a cookie that costs $6 or less, you're still in the market. You're still willing to accept that price. So let's say at $6, it drops down to, let's say, 15. And let's say the price drops again to $4. Again, some of you are out of the market because you're going to be losing money now. So let's say it drops down to 8. And then let's say I drop down to $2 and only just a few of you are still able to sell me a cookie at $2. And so let's say that drops all the way down to, let's just say 3 of you. Okay, so what we've done now is, if you've been playing along at home, we've created what we call a supply schedule, right? So we have all of these different prices, and at every price I've got a different number of people who are willing to accept that price. They're willing to sell their cookies at that price. So this is our supply schedule, and just like we did with demand, we can take each of those combinations of price and quantity and plot them in a graph. So we're going to do it the same way. We're going to track quantity on the x-axis, the price on the vertical, the y-axis. I'm going to jot down those prices, $10, 8, 6, 4, and 2. And then at every price, I'm going to go over to my table, my schedule, and look at how many cookies are going to be sold at that price. So for example, at $10, I know that you guys will sell 30 cookies. So I'm going to draw a little point there. And again, this is in the scanned copy that's in Blackboard. At $8, I'm going to get a slightly lower quantity supplied, so that'll drop down to 26. All right, at $6, it drops down to 15. So plot that point. At $4, it drops down to 8. And this is not drawn to scale, just in case you were wondering. And then at $2, we've got just 3 of you that are willing to sell. All right. So at each price, I'm tracking the quantity supplied and then plotting each of those points. And then I'm going to play connect the dots. And that gives us the supply curve. Okay. And so we can define supply as being either a curve or a schedule that shows what quantity or how much producers will sell at various prices within a period of time, ceteris paribus. So ignoring everything else that might affect whether or not you can, sell a cookie or not, we're looking at how does the price that the market is offering you affect how many cookies you will be willing to sell. All right. So demand told us something about what prices consumers were willing to pay, and now supply tells us something about what prices the sellers, the producers, are willing to accept for their goods and services. All right. Now you'll notice that we've got a positive relationship, right? So as price rises, so does the quantity supplied, right? And so over here, at a relatively high price, I have a high quantity supplied, and at lower prices, I have much lower quantities supplied, right? And now the question becomes, well, what would cause the overall supply curve to shift, right? A change in price means we would just go from, one row to the next in our schedule. A change in price means we would move along our supply curve to one point or another. But what would cause the entire supply curve to shift? Well, remember that number you picked, it represented your cost per cookie. And that cost, you experience that cost because you have to pay for the resources that you need to make your cookie. All right. So let's imagine that the price of the wheat or the flour and the sugar and the chocolate chips goes up. So let's say you experience an increase in your resource prices. Well, what that's going to do is it's going to raise your cost per cookie. And so now, right, let's take your number and double it. And now that all of you have a higher cost per cookie, what we're going to see is that at each of those prices, there's likely going to be fewer people that are willing to accept that price. So at $10 per cookie, there's no longer going to be 30 of you. Maybe there's only 26 of you, or 27 or 28. And so we're going to see that at that price, the quantity supplied goes down, and at $8 and $6 and every other price, the quantity supplied goes down. And so we see the supply curve shift to the left. And this is how we represent a decrease in supply, right? At every price, at all those various prices, there are fewer sellers willing to accept that price. Now, alternatively, if your resource prices go down, so maybe the price of sugar goes down, the price of flour goes down, the price of chocolate goes down, well, that's all going to lower your cost per cookie. So take your original number and cut it in half now. And so if everybody has lower costs, then that means that at each of those prices, we would expect there to be a greater quantity supplied. And if we translate that into our graph, that means that at every price, we'd have a higher quantity supplied, and that would cause the supply curve to shift to the right. And so an increase in supply will look like a rightward shift. Okay. Now this is where we got to be very careful on the supply side, because if you think about supply increasing or decreasing, and you show that curve going up or down, you're actually going to be showing the exact opposite of what we intend. So we've got to make sure that we know, that we know to remember that when supply increases, the curve shifts to the right, and when supply decreases, it shifts to the left. It's the same for demand. Okay. So that's just one determinant of supply, resource prices. All right. So we have change in price. We get movement along the supply curve, or we move from one row to the next in the supply schedule. But if the resource prices change, then we get a complete shift in the supply curve. Now, the other determinants of supply, one is technology, right? So technology is simply the way that we produce a good or service. So there are different ways to make a cookie, right? And each way represents a different level of technology. So maybe you're making cookies, at home, and you have a blender, a mixing bowl, an oven, a cookie sheet, right? That's one level of technology to make a cookie. But what if you get your hands on a cookie making robot, right? Well, now that's going to speed up, how many cookies you can produce. It's going to reduce the amount of time that you have to spend, mixing or baking or whatever, because now the robot can do a lot of the work. So with an increase in technology, we would expect that to lower your cost per cookie, right? That's going to save you time and money having a robot helper. And by reducing your cost per cookie, you guys are going to be willing to sell more cookies at each price. So with an increase in technology, we would expect the supply curve to increase or shift to the right. Now, on the other hand, if I come in and I break your cookie robot, and I break your oven, and you're back to cooking or baking cookies over a wooden stove or wood fire, well, that's a loss of technology. that's going to raise your cost per cookie, and we would see that the supply of cookies would decrease now. It would shift back to the left. So that's the second determinant. So we've got resource prices and technology. Now in addition to that, we've got a few others. Just like on demand side, the supply is going to be affected by expectations. So you guys, the cookie makers, you're going to decide whether or not to sell a cookie at a certain price today based on what you think might happen in the future. So if you generally have positive expectations about the future, that means you're more likely to sell cookies today. And so positive expectations would lead to an increase in the supply. Whereas if you guys have negative expectations, you're pessimistic about the future, we would probably see a decrease in the supply of cookies. The fourth determinant of supply is taxes and regulations. All right, so if the government were to impose a cookie tax, right? Well, a tax is another form of a cost for you guys. So you guys have money that you spend to get the sugar and the flour and the chocolate, right? That's a cost. But now a tax imposed by the government is an additional cost. So if we impose taxes on the suppliers of a good or service, it's like raising their costs, and we would see the supply of that good or service go down. Alternatively, if we lowered taxes on producers, so if we eliminated the tax on the cookies, then you guys would be able to supply more cookies because you'd be able to keep more of that money and spend it on, actually making cookies instead. Regulations would have the same impact. So I may impose a regulation that says you have to install an energy efficient oven, right? Well, that's going to take additional money. They're not cheap, and so that's imposing additional costs on you. Or maybe I say that at the end of every week you've got to fill out this form, proving that you paid your workers minimum wage, or that maybe you passed a health inspection, right? So it's not necessarily something that costs you more money, but it's going to take you time to sit down and fill out that form every week. And so I'm imposing another cost in the form of a time commitment to comply with the regulations. So if we impose more and more regulations on firms, it's going to increase their costs in terms of time and money, which means they're going to supply less of their good or service. So supply will decrease. And on the other hand, if we reduce regulations or we eliminate regulations, that frees up time and money, which you can then use to actually make your product. And so with fewer regulations, we would see an increase in the supply of the good or service. Now the final determinant is similar to one of the determinants of demand. Whereas on demand, we had the number of buyers affecting the demand. Now we're going to have the number of sellers affecting the supply. So if we were to go through the same experiment and there were twice as many people, right? Well, then at every price, I would expect there to be roughly twice as many people that were willing to sell the cookie. So if we increase the number of sellers in the market, it will increase the market supply. And alternatively, if I surveyed only half as many people, well, at every price there'd be a lower quantity supplied, and so we'd see that with fewer sellers, we would get a decrease in supply. So again, with supply, we've got the positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So a change in price means we'll see a movement along the supply curve. And then we have the five other determinants of supply. Resource prices, technology, number of buyers, seller expectations, and taxes and regulations. So if any one of those changes, we would see an actual shift in the entire supply curve. So that concludes this lecture on market supply.